This is Villain for All Seasons, Season 2, Episode 7. I'm Ben.
I'm Dan.
I'm Andrew.
This week we're speaking of Rania Khalek. Rania Khalek is a Lebanese-American journalist, host, presenter, just all-around cool person, honestly. You can find her at Breakthrough News as the host of Dispatches. Highly recommend watching that. She's great. I'm so excited for you guys to watch this one.
Rania Khalek, thank you so much for joining us. This is Villain for All Seasons. I'm Dan.
Ben.
Rania, I'm sure you've heard No Other Land won Best Documentary at the Academy Awards last night. Do you view this as a sea change about Palestine or the Middle East, or do you think it's just a one-off?
I mean, I guess we have to look at it like in a longer context. I think people will look back at this years from now and see it as part of a series of that sea change you just mentioned. I mean, I know the last time there was the Oscars, there was that movie Zone of Interest, I think. Was it the Oscars?
Right.
Yeah.
That had won. And I know the director wasn't Israeli, but he was Jewish and he like got up and made a speech and specifically made a parallel to Gaza, which was really, cool and brave of him to do. And he got totally dunked on by Hollywood afterwards. So I think that this is part of that ongoing sea change, I guess. I know some people were frustrated because you had a Palestinian man and then the Israeli, I don't know if it was one of the producers or they directed it together. You can correct me on that. But I know the Israeli guy had made some comments that were good, but also irritated some people because he compared Palestinian suffering to Israeli suffering, talked about October 7th being this big crime. And it's just like, come on, dude. But it's still
Yeah.
important that ethnic cleansing got mentioned. But I also think it speaks to the fact that, had the Palestinian filmmaker who it was his story been alone in that and spoken that way on his own, I'm not sure if people would have received it the same way. And it just speaks to the fact that a lot of white liberals still need an Israeli to like humanize Palestinians for them to some degree. I hope that changes at some point. That said, I think it's important ethnic cleansing was mentioned. And I think in the broader scheme of things, I think more things like this will continue to happen because people are just so disgusted by what Israel does to Palestinians quite openly.
I mean, yeah, I totally agree with that. I mean, speaking of, this is a good segue just to really dive into the real big news about things beyond Hollywood. Rania, I know that you're based in Lebanon, and I definitely want to get into that a little bit later, but obviously want to keep zooming in on Palestine here. Can you talk about Israel's recent decision to just halt all aid delivery to Palestine?
Yeah, I mean, they're doing exactly what they did in the beginning. Remember when Yoav Gallant, like a few days after October 7th, openly said, we're basically shutting down Gaza, no food, no electricity, no water. And a lot of the world was horrified by that, but you saw the Americans under Biden basically say, no, 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 we don't agree with that, but that's not what they're actually doing. And the Europeans did something similar and then just made it all about Hamas. And then we're seeing like 2.0 of that now. I mean, Israel, since the ceasefire went into effect, they didn't want the ceasefire. It was forced on them. It was forced on them to some degree by facts on the ground. But most importantly, it was forced on them by Donald Trump because Trump wanted to enter office having like this win and not having to deal with a war that he saw as Biden's war. That was just like a headache. So Israel was forced into this ceasefire and they never intended for it to be permanent. From the beginning, they said so, that their officials say so. They never intended for this to be permanent. And since the ceasefire went into place, the Israelis have tried every way imaginable to undermine it. And now they're doing that with the support of the Trump administration because now the Trump administration is like, fine, I don't care anymore. You got most of the hostages back. And like we wanted to look like the winners who came and saved the day. And we already did that. And they absolutely support Israel shutting off Gaza. They said so. They're like, Israel has every right to do this, which is, obviously, against international law. But what does that mean anymore? I think it's interesting also to see the reaction the second time around. The first time around, it horrified everybody. The second time around, we're all horrified, but we're like, yeah, that makes sense because there's no international law, or even a pretense of it. And then you have the Europeans coming out and also blaming Hamas when Israel just like blatantly is the one violating the ceasefire and you can go and track it. It's clear. So ultimately, this is what the Israelis wanted to do. They wanted to continue. And actually, I think what we're going to see happen, I mean, I can't predict the future, but based on this trajectory, I mean, the Israelis basically just are going to leave Gaza in this the status quo is going to become like what it is right now, where people just live in rubble. They're not going to be able to be rebuilt. They're going to die off. Like people in Gaza are going to continue to die from like preventable diseases. Israel's going to occasionally bomb them. That's probably not going to be as vicious as what we witnessed over the past 15 months. But they're just like they've been doing throughout the ceasefire. They're going to do drone strikes here and there. They're going to shoot at people in the areas they're still stationed. And they're not going to allow them to rebuild their homes. And so I think you're going to see a Gaza siege that's like on steroids of what we witnessed over like 15 years, where it's the siege on Gaza, but way worse. And also people having no shelter and just having to like live in rubble. And it's horrifying because the world is going to allow that to happen for a bit longer.
Rania, I want to talk about Assel Rod, something that she recently tweeted. I really like following her, and I think that you retweeted this as well. And you spoke to this just a little bit, but just to drive home the point, she tweeted, "Remember when the Biden administration told you Israel wasn't blocking aid to Gaza?" And I'm just curious, how is the Biden administration, how were they seen in Lebanon? And from your perspective, did you expect Biden to align this closely with Netanyahu?
Those are really good questions. And yeah,
Thank you.
big Rad fan here. She's
Yeah,
fantastic.
yeah, it's great.
Uh, so okay, to the first issue that you asked about, which is how people in Lebanon perceived the Biden administration. Lebanon's a really polarized place, so it depends. But a lot of people, including people who aren't even pro-resistance, were really disgusted by the genocide in Gaza, and I think recognized that they're not seen that differently by the Americans than people in Palestine are. And then it was made even worse by the escalation that took place in Lebanon. And they see, like a lot of people in Lebanon will tell you, and again, I want to clarify, like I can't speak for everyone here because it is a very divided place with some people who do support Trump and hate Palestinians and want to make peace with Israel. But I would say that that's a marginal view, but it does exist here. But a lot of people, even ones that surprised me, would say things to me like, oh, both these parties are the same. It doesn't matter who's in charge, Democrat or Republican. They all just bomb us. That's how they see it. It's pretty, which is true. um, so they perceive the Biden administration as just being like, America's the dictator of the world. Everyone kind of understands that in the global South, right? Like, why else does it matter who's president there? No matter where you live in the world, unlike anywhere else in the world. But also, it's dictator of the world that will always bomb the Middle East constantly and always interfere in the Middle East and kill people in the Middle East and has like a genocidal drive in the Middle East and will always back anything Israel wants. That's how Israel's seen. As for what was the second thing you asked me? Sorry.
Just, did you expect Biden to align so closely with
Oh,
Netanyahu?
so no, not like this. I mean, did I expect Biden to like stand in the way of Israel ethnically cleansing Palestinians? No, because my entire life, not whatever party's in charge, that is what happens, and it continues to happen because Israel is an extension of the United States, and that's why it can get away with whatever it wants because this is, in service of American imperialism. That said, I did think there'd be some daylight because of the fact that Netanyahu is Likud, and Likud is very much aligned with Republicans. Whereas the Democratic Party in the US is, as much as they act like Republicans, they're not quite as, messianic as they are. And they just do imperialism a little bit differently. So, I thought when Biden became president in 2020, I was surprised that he basically carried on Trump's policies that Democrats claim to oppose. And then on top of that, like I really thought there would be limits. Like, yeah, I thought Israel would get away with maybe like 2 or 3 months of just viciously murdering Palestinians in Gaza. I didn't think it'd go on for 15 months. Like, I think I was definitely blown away by the depravity of the Biden administration. And not just Biden, because Biden was kind of like a shell of himself anyway,
Yep.
very ideologically Zionist, but like who was really running the show was like people like Jake Sullivan and Brett McGurk and I can't remember the names of the others, but they're all just
Matthew
disgusting
Miller.
monsters. Thank you, Matthew Miller. I mean, these are
Yeah.
people that, I only wish the worst for them in life. And if karma really is a thing, like they'll all get some horrible disease and die slow, torturous deaths because it's just these people are like a bunch of mini Hitlers as far as I'm concerned.
Mhm.
And I think that was the lesson to me watching the Biden administration and all the people in it do what they did over Gaza. Not that I ever thought any of these people gave a shit about like human rights or international law or the things they claim to care about. Just they usually have a veneer of that, you know? And I also just didn't understand how genocidal they are. Like I really like
Yeah.
it's they I think they actually like have this deep-seated genocidal drive towards a significant part of the world. And it was demonstrated to me throughout the Biden administration in such a shocking way, to the point where, I mean, we all watched it, you guys. Like we saw Israelis like let dogs maul a mentally disabled Palestinian man on camera. Like we saw like the reading out of what happened at the end of that guy's life. We saw, you know, Hind, what happened with Hind Rajab, and like heard her screams. We saw the Israelis leave premature babies to starve to death intentionally. We saw them wearing the lingerie of, you know, in women's houses that they, you know, destroyed. We saw them on video raping a Palestinian prisoner. And then we saw them go on TV and defend it and say they're going to do it more. Like, and it just goes on and on and on. And there was just there's nothing. That's what I learned. There's nothing the Israelis can do to a Palestinian or to an Arab that's unacceptable to the people in charge of US empire. Nothing, even for the purposes of PR, doesn't matter.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think once we were dispelled of like the pretense that there actually was a president in charge, because we all knew, right? We all knew that Biden was not there. So it was a real kind of look behind the curtain of what happens when we know that whoever the president is actually isn't running the show, and we don't need to pretend he's running the show because we don't need to make him look good or get reelected or anything. And yeah, I think the same. I think that's what the empire really wants to do when it's allowed to.
One thing before we leave Biden, I thought it was way past the point. He might have been even past the election at this point, but there's that photo of him holding Kaladi's book. I'm sure I pronounced his name wrong, but the 100 Years War Against Palestine. Do you remember that? What was the
Yeah.
purpose of that? I mean, is he just like forgive the phrase, was this his like road to Damascus moment here?
I honestly don't know. Like, I don't even know if he can read at this point. And
Yeah.
I'm being a little bit funny when I say that, but I actually mean that. Like, the guy is so far gone. I mean, if you've ever seen an elderly person with dementia, it's what Joe Biden exhibits. Like,
Yeah.
I'm not sitting here diagnosing him, but definitely he's got some form. Like the way he just stares into like nothingness. It's sad actually to watch. Like if he wasn't Hitler in my mind, I'd feel bad for him, but because he is, I don't.
Mhm.
But I don't know. I don't know if that was like meant to troll people.
It felt like
I
that.
don't know
That
if
was
it
my
was meant
guess.
to. Yeah, because it was after the election, right? Like that happened after
Yeah.
the election. So
Yeah.
I'm like, you don't really gain anything from this. Like Arabs already hate you. They're never gonna like you. So, you know, this is no one's looking at that and going, oh, maybe he sees us now. Like, you know what I
Yeah.
mean?
Yeah.
So I don't know. I don't know. I think it was probably honestly the more pessimistic side of me or cynical side of me thinks it was a sick joke by one of his aides.
Yeah. It feels like that.
Yeah.
That's my guess.
Yeah.
Ronnie, I want to talk a little bit about Syria. I think you've been really good on this, and I love to hear your takes on it, specifically with this context, which is right after Assad fell. Really, the American left seemed divided, or maybe said better, there was this opinion that the left really couldn't simultaneously believe that Assad was despotic, but also believing the West had long wanted to try and overthrow him, and did try to overthrow him because of his alignment with the Palestinian cause. What were your thoughts on Assad?
Well, so I've never been shy about saying it. And ultimately, there was a period of time where I wasn't let into Syria because I would say it, even though I get called an Assadist. I'm sure you've seen like all the time.
I read your
It's
Wikipedia.
actually, yeah. Well, but isn't that crazy though? My Wikipedia, like, it's funny, just on a little like tangent. My Wikipedia initially got deleted years ago because Zionists wouldn't leave it alone. They kept vandalizing it so that the first line would say like Rania Khalek is a Putin-loving like Assadist anti-Semite or something. It was just like ridiculous language, bombastic language like that. And I kept like emailing Wikipedia and being like, look, like I know I have no control over my own page, but this is like slander. And it's the first thing people see when they Google me. And they couldn't prevent the vandalism, so they had just deleted the page. So recently I noticed a new Wikipedia page cropped up, and under like my career, it's literally just trips I took to Syria. So I'm just like, this is like a blip in everything I've done as a journalist. But
Hmm.
okay, I guess that's my career now, is I went to Syria and people were mad at me. It
Hmm.
just shows you like people just will never let that go. But no, so look, I'm Lebanese American, but I have family in Syria as well. Like a lot of people do, because these borders are, colonial borders that were drawn in between our families' villages.
Hmm.
Um, and so I have like a connection to Syria in that respect. And I obviously like used to be really big in like I was at the electronic intifada. I was always covering Palestine, but it was when Hillary Clinton was about to be elected president, or so I thought. She was saying one of the first things she was going to do was a no-fly zone in Syria. And I was really scared about what that meant, because I have family in Syria. They're from a minority sect, and like that would have meant like really horrible people taking over the country who were carrying out atrocities against my own relatives. So that's initially why I started covering Syria, but I've always been very clear. Syria has always been a police state. I grew up knowing it was a police state. I grew up knowing they were occupying Lebanon. And Syria, under the Assad family, was a country that was full of contradictions. On the one hand, Hafez al-Assad especially, like they, sometimes they were on the side of the Palestinians, sometimes they helped the Americans. They were a very self-interested country, always to the benefit of Syria, at least until, Bashar al-Assad fled. Or maybe even before that. But again, a country full of contradictions. And also, everyone knew growing up that Syria was this kind of like almost like cartoonish police state, where you just like had to be really careful what you said, like the walls have ears sort of place. And it was like that. There's no question. Really politically repressive. That said, in the Syria under the Assads, you also did have a kind of pluralism and a safeguarding of like Syria's history and culture that was really important. It's social fabric. And before Bashar al-Assad like introduced neoliberal reforms in like the early 2000s, Syria was a place where everything was really free and affordable. And that kind of like slowly disintegrated from some really stupid privatization reforms that gave rise to the uprising to some degree in 2011, but also got worse after war and sanctions. So I guess I say all that to say Syria was a brutal place, but also a beautiful place. And Syria, I mean, Syria, I'm sure I haven't been there since Assad. I actually haven't been to Syria since 2019. But Syria is still, I'm sure, a beautiful place, but it's going through a very difficult time now because the people who took over, um, not all of them, but a lot of them have very, sectarian views. And they also want to get revenge on people they feel, carried out atrocities against their uprising, their opposition movement, their, militancy. And that has a sectarian basis to it. And then also there's foreign fighters there from like other parts of the world who have really disgusting views about how Syria should run, and they're carrying out atrocities. And then on top of that, you have Turkey that's basically like totally controlling the levers of power in Syria to the benefit of Turkey, not Syria. And the economy is just in like crumbling right now for a lot of reasons, not just the sanctions, but also because Syria has just opened its market completely under Ahmed al-Sharaa. So I don't know. It remains to be seen. It's in a transitional period, but Syria doesn't look good. And then you have the Israelis, which are a whole nother can of worms in Syria. And you have the new Syrian government under Ahmed al-Sharaa, like just kind of shrugging their shoulders and being like, whatever, as the Israelis literally seize Syrian land. So it's kind of a disaster. It's really bad for Lebanon and for resistance in the region. And yeah, all to take it back to, I'm happy to say more about Assad, but it's a country that was full of contradictions and ultimately was abandoned by a very corrupt leader who didn't really know how to lead, and who kind of betrayed his people in many ways.
Roddy, I want to talk a little bit about Shara, and just before we leave, like what for our listeners, can you give a little bit of background on him and really the overthrow of Assad? Yeah, we'll start there and then maybe dive in a little bit more.
So Ahmed al-Sharaa is an interesting character because if you read the mainstream media right now about him, it's like he had an interesting journey in life with lots of phases. We all go through phases, you guys.
Um,
For some of us, that phase could be joining Al Qaeda for a period of time in our lives. It's just something you do when you're stupid and young. You don't really know what Al
Yeah.
Qaeda is. No, Mohammed al-Jolani is a Syrian guy whose family is originally from the Golan. But from what I understand, he was born in Saudi Arabia, but grew up in Damascus. I actually knew people who went to high school with him. He's a young guy. He's like, for somebody who's the leader of a country, I think he's 42 years old. So if anybody's approaching 40, you should feel very unaccomplished if you haven't done what Mohammed al-Jolani's done, or sorry, Ahmad al-Shara. But this is somebody who in, the early 2000s got swept up in the whole Salafi jihadi move to go to Iraq, to go fight in Iraq with Al Qaeda. And that's important to mention, the US war in Iraq, that was supposedly to go find weapons of mass destruction, but also because somehow Saddam Hussein was responsible for 9/11, which apparently like 40% of Americans still sadly believe. There was never Al Qaeda in Iraq until after the Americans invaded. And then this guy called Zarqawi went to Iraq to fight, started Al Qaeda, and that started Al Qaeda in Iraq. And that was actually when Al Qaeda had a bit of a transformation and became a very sectarian organization that was obsessed with basically eliminating Shias specifically. And Iraq was like, majority Shia. And he committed horrible atrocities. So Ahmed al-Shara is, in Damascus, and he sees the war in Iraq getting started, and he decides to go to Iraq and fight with Al Qaeda because it was a phase in his life. I think he was like probably 18 or 19 years old. And so he did that for a period of time when Al Qaeda had its most brutal, it was a brutal, not that it ever wasn't a brutal organization, but like Al Qaeda was just vicious, like terrorizing people for being Shia in Iraq. Car bombs, blowing up mosques, blowing up marketplaces. In addition, to fighting the American occupiers as well. But it was a very Sunni supremacist movement in Iraq. And Ahmed al-Shara eventually ends up getting captured by the Americans and imprisoned. And he, he did his prison time in a few different American prison sites, including like Camp Bucca, and a few others as well. And actually, there is suspicion that he became like an informant for the Americans at some point during that time, but nobody could really prove it. But who knows, right? When you go into an American prison and then you come out, an American prison in the Middle East and come out, it's kind of weird, but okay, whatever. He's basically in Al Qaeda, and then 2011 comes, Al Qaeda in Iraq. Then 2011 comes, and Mr. Baghdadi, the head of, Islamic State in Iraq, which, becomes ISIS, sees the uprising in Syria as an opportunity and dispatches Mohammed al-Jolani, the Syrian, to go start a branch in Syria and basically take advantage of the momentum behind overthrowing the Assad regime. And that's how you get Jabhat al-Nusra, which was started by Mohammed Jolani. It's the Al-Qaeda branch in Syria. And it's operating in Syria by late 2011. And that's according to American intelligence. And he's committing atrocities, by the way. This isn't like, oh, we just want to save the people from Assad, the butcher. It's like same thing, car bombs, blowing shit up, assassinating people, killing civilians, terrorizing them. And that extended into Lebanon, by the way, and ultimately into Iraq, because then you had the rise of ISIS. And actually, Baghdadi and Jolani end up splitting because they had a difference of opinion about strategy. So Jolani's head of Jabhat al-Nusra splits from ISIS. ISIS is in the hands of Baghdadi. And now these are two kind of competing organizations in any area in Syria where the government was pushed out. These are the organizations that would come and take over because they were the most powerful, most ideologically driven, and had the most fighters and most money. And so this is Jolani's life for a while, heading Jabhat al-Nusra, building and all that, all that jazz, this phase of his life. And ultimately he loses. And you had that time, that period of time where you had the green buses in Syria, where all the opposition fighters would basically surrender to the regime for safe passage from the areas they had taken over to go to Idlib. And that's what happened to a lot of the Nusra guys and Al-Qaeda guys and, all the different armies that existed, Jaish al-Islam, all these, the Ahrar al-Sham, a million different names for a million different militias that all had the same ideology, end up in Idlib. And then the conflict is kind of frozen in 2019. And Jolani is in Idlib and basically spends 2019 until late last year consolidating power. and trying to rebrand himself as like a statesman who's basically in charge of governing Idlib. And he did a pretty good job, by the way, of rebranding himself and of also consolidating power in a pretty brutal way, but he did it. And then came late last year when the Turks took advantage of the weakening of the resistance axis because of the war Israel had inflicted on Lebanon against Hezbollah, and uses that as an opportunity to try to leverage the power they had behind Jolani to get the Assad regime to play ball with them. And it was wildly successful, I think, beyond even Turkey's dreams.
Mhm.
And then you have Jolani, coming into Damascus within a couple weeks. And now he's their leader. And here we are. That's like an abridged version. And now he's been, he's got, I don't know. I joke that Boston Consulting Group is like advising him on how to dress and how to behave. He's definitely being advised. I mean, I know he actually has a stylist, and he's done a
Wait,
really good job.
You know he has
Yeah.
a stylist?
Yeah, yeah. So it was like reported that he has a stylist by
Oh
like
my
the people
gosh.
who support him.
Okay.
I mean, I'm not surprised. Like it's like
Yep.
he's wearing expensive clothes and like he looks very different. Like there's, the phases of Jolani going back to his roots of Ahmed al-Sharaa. And then he just goes and gives these interviews where he completely papers over his time in Al-Qaeda. And he literally, there was an interview with CNN well before they had taken over Damascus, but I think at that point they'd had like Aleppo and Homs,
Mhm.
where he like sits there and describes it as a journey. And everybody changes, everybody evolves. You're one person in your 20s, you're another person in your 30s, and you're certainly different and more mature in your 40s. And I'm just sitting here like, this is insane. This guy
Yeah.
he was a deputy emir in ISIS.
Mhm.
And now he's the head of Syria, and we're all supposed to cheer him. It's insane.
I remember college, crazy stuff happens.
I had bangs once.
Oh God.
When I think
Similar.
about Jelani slash Shara, I'm trying to be optimistic, and I say this just because I see accounts on X, Twitter, whatever, by like Sarah XO and Syria Girl, and they even posted. It was over New Year's, and they were posting the celebrations, the New Year's Eve celebrations. I was like, wow, even pretty hardliners against Western imperialism, etc., are trying to view this as an optimistic moment. What do you think the ideal outcome is in Syria at this point?
I mean, look, I think the ideal outcome for Syria, just like any other part of the region, would be for Syria to have the sovereignty to forge a path that they choose to forge. I don't see that happening right now because right now the path that's being forged in Syria is not actually in the hands of Syrians.
Mhm.
It's in the hands of Turkey and Israel and the US. That's who's in charge in Syria right now, depending on which part of the country you're talking about.
Mhm.
So, and there, I think that a lot of people benefit from a weakened Syria, and that means a balkanized Syria.
Yep.
And I have to give it to Ahmed al-Sharaa. He is trying to consolidate control over the country, trying to have these negotiations with like the SDF, for example. And he's saying some of the right things, but you look at who he's put in power, and it tells a bit of a different story. I mean, when your justice minister is like on video stoning a woman,
Yep.
that doesn't, that's a bit unsettling.
Mhm.
When you're talking about being in power for the next 4 years at least without any
Yep.
elections, I'm not saying elections fix everything. I mean, this is a chaotic transition period. I am not, I'm not naive about that. But that suggests to me that you just want to be in power forever. Like, I want to be optimistic, and generally I am an optimistic person, but even I'm looking at the situation and I'm very, very pessimistic about what the outcome is going to be. I don't think Jolani is going to have the power to keep a lid on these HTS guys who have an ideology that is eliminationist.
Mhm.
And they're going around and committing crimes against people in the countryside of Homs, for example. And using the idea of like natural acts of revenge against regime remnants to basically like, dismiss it as not important. But this is like, I mean, and this is not getting covered in the media because the media is like still, reveling in the euphoria of not having Assad in power. And look, Syria was very repressive under Assad, and I understand some of that euphoria because for the first time, people do feel like they can breathe. It was a place where you would go there and like they're not shy about how they watch you. You can't say what you think for real. You do have to be careful, and it feels very suffocating in that respect. And so that's good that that's over. But there's another kind of fear that exists in Syria now that everyone's pretending isn't there because they want to enjoy the moment. But it is there, and people are being killed. People are being kidnapped and ransomed or just disappeared. People's homes are being stolen. And people are, it's not everybody, but some people are frightened. And then again, I want to go back to like the Israel factor here. The Israelis have literally occupied portions of Syria, set up permanent military bases, and they are pushing further and further in, and then even using manufactured crises like they did over the weekend with the Druze and Jedamana, because there was like clashes between some like armed Syrian Druze people and the HTS guys, like kind of overblowing that and using that as we're going to go protect the Druze and Jedamana when it's like that's not, you know, that Jedamana is right outside Damascus. Like it's like a suburb of Damascus, basically. So Syria, the Israelis are creeping their way further into Syria. And it's really dangerous because when the Israelis creep in, they don't leave. They keep it.
Yeah.
And then you have Turkey that's like calling the shots from, every aspect of governance. So in this kind of situation, this is not the ideal Syria where there's sovereignty and people get to forge the path that they want for Syria as a country. It's outside actors intervening in what the future Syria looks like. And some of their views are actually contradictory, like between the Turks and the Israelis, for example. And that could easily turn into a proxy war inside Syria between the Turks and the Israelis. And then there's the economic factor. The Americans haven't taken away the sanctions yet because they want to use them as leverage. So Syria's economy is crap. And that just creates like a pressure cooker as well, because from what I understand, since Assad fell, the electricity situation in Damascus has actually gotten worse. People can't afford anything. And it's not because Assad was doing anything fantastic. It's because Jolani came in, or Ahmed al-Sharaa came in. I'm having an identity crisis for the guy. And he immediately opened the markets up to every product. And so the markets have been flooded. People don't have money in Syria. And then the Qataris were supposed to like help them give a 400% salary increase to state employees, but they actually backed out of that because they're scared of American sanctions. So people in Syria don't have money. They're incredibly poor and they can't afford things even more than they could have before. And they have no electricity. So it's a disaster.
I mean, as you said, like balkanization, chaos is the goal here, right? I mean, if
Yeah.
you not as a Syrian, but as, like a Western power, basically.
Yeah, there's also something a little bit interesting too, because like there's these people who really, became the PR agents of HTS. People like, there's Charles Lister, whose name I thought I'd never have to see again, but then here he is, all over everyone's Twitter feed again. But like someone like him who's very pro-Israel is now like glitching because because he's like, why is Israel doing this? Syria finally has a government that's not going to be a threat to them, and I'm just like giggling a little bit at that because I'm just like, did you really think that like the Israelis were just going to be okay? Like, are you insane? The Israelis are never going to be okay with like a united Syria that has power. Never, not to any of the countries that surround them. I mean, you literally have a government in Syria that has officials in it who are like, no, 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 we want to eventually normalize with the Israelis, and we're never going to fight them, we promise. And they can bomb all of our military infrastructure, and we're just going to be okay with that. And the Israelis are still like, nope, not good enough. I mean, it's horrible,
They
but
want the whole thing.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Ronnie, I want to move on to Lebanon. I really want to focus on this topic just because I'm excited to talk to you about it specifically. But just for our listeners, can you give a little bit of the background on Lebanon, like the just a short history, a bridge history, if you don't mind, and then also Hezbollah's unique role in the country?
So Lebanon is a country to the north of historic Palestine, and it has a sect-based democratic system where that was imposed on Lebanon by the French and then upheld after the Civil War by the West and the Saudis, where the prime minister has to be a Sunni Muslim, the speaker of parliament is a Shia Muslim, the president is always a Christian Maronite. And there are parties that are largely based on sect, which gives, rise to like clientelism, and keeps people quite divided. It keeps Lebanon very weak, the way that the government system here is set up. And it was meant to be that way. It was meant to be a small, weak country. So before France and Britain drew borders in the region, because that's what, colonial powers do, the area was just considered Greater Syria, like Lebanon, Palestine, Syria of today, Jordan, etc. This was considered like all like Greater Syria. And then it was divided by these countries that were created by the British and the French, and Lebanon, and I believe Syria was put in the French, like was basically under French rule, and Palestine and Jordan and Iraq were under British rule. And this was after like World War One. And that's when I'm sure you guys are aware of this. That's when like the British did the mandate in Palestine, giving like, a significant chunk of it to European Jewish settlers to create a country called Israel, which is the problem we're still dealing with in the region today, right? Because it was this settler colonial entity that was implanted here that has, been a outpost for colonialism and empire, and just continues to cause problems. Where does Lebanon fit into that? Well, in terms of the Greater Israel Project, Lebanon, the south of it, is part of supposedly Greater Israel, as far as like the sort of crazy ones see it. And even the early Zionists saw it. And so there's always been an Israeli attempt to take southern Lebanon. They've repeatedly invaded it. And this is even before Hezbollah existed, by the way. Repeatedly invaded it. They occupied it for a lengthy period of time. But before I get to that, I'll also say there was an attempt by the French to create Lebanon as a Christian country. Like just like Israel's supposed to be a Jewish state, Lebanon was ideally supposed to be a Christian Maronite, specifically Maronite state. And there are people in Lebanon who still have that dream. And those are the people who align themselves with Israel, and actually have worked and collaborated with the Israelis during the civil war in Lebanon. So anyways, all that's to say, the Israelis have always treated southern Lebanon like their playground. And the people of the South, who were largely like farmers and peasants in the past, suffered tremendously because of that. And the South is majority Shia, though there are Christians and Druze and Sunnis in the South as well. So the Lebanese Civil War starts in the late 1970s. And depending on who you talk to, I take the interpretation, because I'm a leftist, and the facts show it, that war was largely a war of many outside powers to basically destroy the Arab left. At least the first phase of that war. That's the reason, there was the Palestinian like armed resistance was based in Lebanon, and that had to be destroyed as well. So the US and the Israelis and the French actually had right-wing fascistic proxies in Lebanon that fought on their behalf, and the leaders of those proxies are still in power in Lebanon today. That's where you get things like the Lebanese forces, headed by Samir Jaja, and the Kataeb Party as well, headed by the Jmeyev, these sorts of things. Anyway, so the first phase of the Lebanese Civil War is largely an attack on Palestinian resistance and the Arab left, and it largely, by the way, succeeds. The Palestinians end up having to like leave. The armed movement left the country and went to like, I think, Tunisia. And that's when Sabra and Shatila happened, by the way, in 1982. And then that's 1982 is also when the Israelis invaded Lebanon again, because they'd invaded it several times before that, but invaded all the way up to Beirut. And then they stayed and occupied huge parts of the South. And so there was an Israeli occupation in Lebanon from like the mid 80s until 2000, when it was liberated. And the reason it was liberated is because in the 80s, after the Arab left was basically killed and Palestinian resistance was forced to leave, you had the rise of another resistance movement called Hezbollah. And that became the dominant resistance movement in Lebanon, and ultimately, I would say, in the region. But what really put them on the map was the fight with Israel against the Israeli occupation, until they actually kicked the Israelis out in 2000. It was the first time Arab land, had literally been liberated by armed resistance in this region after so many losses. And Hezbollah only became more powerful after that, because the Israelis invaded again in 2006. And, there was a 33-day long bombing campaign as a result. And Hezbollah basically gave the Israelis a bloody nose. They weren't able to actually take or occupy any village, and they had to leave in humiliation and defeat. And there hadn't been a war since then. There was the war in Syria that the Hezbollah got involved with to protect their supply line in Syria, and also prevent Syria from collapsing to what was seen as the biggest existential threat aside from Israel, which was ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And that's why Hezbollah got involved in that war, as well as Iran. But they hadn't fought the Israelis, they hadn't had to fight the Israelis because they established deterrence in Lebanon from 2006 until October 7th, 2023, when the genocide in Gaza began. And on October 8th, Hezbollah started launching initially missiles at Israeli occupied Lebanese land, at Israeli military bases. And then it began a tit for tat with the Israelis for about a year until it culminated into a massive, horrific, catastrophic escalation on Lebanon and a huge attempt to destroy Hezbollah, including killing its Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah and the rest of its senior leadership. But ultimately, the Israelis failed in destroying Hezbollah. It still exists. They were not able to occupy beyond a few kilometers into Lebanon. And, you could say in that sense, the Israelis lost. But at the same time, I wouldn't necessarily call it a win for Hezbollah because Lebanon had way higher deterrent capacity than it has now. The Israelis are staying in Lebanon and occupying several villages. And also the loss of Syria, which happened after the ceasefire in Lebanon. I mean, the loss of Syria is like a really, I wouldn't say nail in the coffin because there'll always be resistance in Lebanon, but it's a huge obstacle to be able to continue to fight Israel or defend against Israel in a significant and powerful way. So we're looking at various situations pre and post 2024 on Lebanon, war on Lebanon, let's call it.
Rania, I first started learning about Lebanon actually via George Galloway. He once said that if Lebanon were to have a true election, Nasrallah would be the true elected leader. This was in 2006, so just a little context there. But anyways, can you talk about how Nasrallah is viewed in the country? And I know that you said that, Lebanon isn't a monolith. There's divided opinions throughout the country. But yeah, if you could just talk about how Nasrallah was viewed beyond the country, if something could even, approximate that.
I mean, I think you can look at the funeral last week to get an idea of how he's viewed in the sense that, there was like over 1 million people that attended his funeral in a country of like around 6 million people. I think 140,000 people flew into the country for the funeral from all over the world, which is also a lot of people. This is somebody who was not just the head of the resistance in Lebanon, he was the head of the resistance axis.
Mhm.
He was like a bigger than life figure, he was in charge for so long. I mean, I don't remember a time when he wasn't in charge as like the leader of Hezbollah, the leader of the resistance. I can't remember a time when, this is somebody who, when he gave a speech, not just Lebanon stopped to listen, the world would stop to listen, both his supporters and his enemies. I mean, give me somebody else who gives a speech in the White House National Security Council, and people, millions and millions of people across the region in the Middle East, and then even across the global South are watching, especially after October 7th, but even before that. So really a larger than life kind of once in a lifetime type leader, very charismatic. And, despite the fact that he was in charge of a religious Islamist Shia, specifically organization in Lebanon, he was able to speak to the sentiments of resistance to people across sects. I mean, look, anybody who's anti-resistance hated the guy for obvious reasons. They're anti-resistance. But I mean, Christians, Druze, Sunnis, atheists who believed in the cause of resistance to Israel, to imperialism, to liberation of land in the Middle East and beyond, even if they don't connect with those identities, watched this man's speeches because they were full of really, really smart analysis about what was happening in the region, in the country, in the world. And they were educational and informative to both his base and people beyond that. And like, I think it's really powerful to be able to be in charge of basically a sectarian organization, because that's the way it's built in Lebanon, but to be able to transcend that. And to be able to have people watching you in Syria, in Iraq, in Palestine, and connecting to what you're saying, right? So we don't have that anymore. I mean, that really is a once in a lifetime kind of figure. It's like a Che or, you know, more like a Fidel even, right? Like, or a Hugo Chavez. Um, these kinds of people who could, you know, speak and everybody stops to listen and they make jokes and they're charismatic and you feel like they're speaking to you. Um, that was Hassan Nasrallah. Uh, and you know, I think for people in the south of Lebanon, specifically the Shia community, this war this time around was very much an attack on them as a community. They were all forced to their neighborhoods. They were displaced from their neighborhoods and their villages. They were targeted even where they would flee to. You know, you would see these buildings get targeted in like what were considered safe areas because here's a building of displaced people in a Christian area, which is supposed to be safe, right? But it was still demolished by an Israeli bomb. Um, they were chased and hunted down to try to diminish support for Hezbollah from their base, but it didn't work because again, you saw that funeral last week, and Hassan Nasrallah is dead. Um, and that you know people feel very lost because of that, but they still support resistance, and they always will. And no matter what happens in Lebanon in terms of what happens with Hezbollah moving forward, I mean, I think they'll continue to exist. They're still a very powerful organization, even if weaker than they were 2 years ago. Uh, there will always be resistance here because people are really attached to their land, they're attached to their lives, and they will fight and die for it. Like they will do it over and over again as many a times as they have to. Um, it's just the way people are built and the way they're raised, whether we're talking about Palestine or whether we're talking about South Lebanon.
Thank you for that. That was a great answer. Rania, I want to talk before I get into the last questions, which unfortunately we have to talk a little bit about Trump, I feel like, and the Trump and Zelensky meeting. I
Yeah.
want to talk a little bit about Rania, if you don't mind. And that's Rania, like I said, I've been following you for what feels like forever now. And can you talk a little bit about how you got into journalism and studying the American Empire? And also, I think you were born in Lebanon, but then, like you said, I think you moved to the United States when you were quite young, right?
No, no, actually, I was born in the US.
Oh, you
I'm
were born
like
in the U.S. Okay,
American
right.
born and bred.
All right, all right. We'll put the flag emoji up somewhere.
Yeah, wow. I can't believe you would question my patriotism like that.
Well, I was building up to that in this whole interview. No, you talk about growing up, growing up in the Bush years as well, alongside, just getting into journalism and studying the American Empire.
So I was born into a family that was very political, that believed in, you know, that was very anti-colonial and it was very, you know, much in support of resistance to empire and against Israel. So I grew up with that foundation. Like I grew up being taken to Palestine protests or whenever Israel's bombing Lebanon, going to those protests. I grew up with that conversation constantly in my household, and even in my extended family. Uh, so that definitely gave me a foundational basis to be naturally inclined to oppose US wars, to oppose Zionism. Um, but I actually was radicalized, I would say, into leftism because I accidentally started watching Democracy Now! And the reason I accidentally started watching Democracy Now! Is because Barack Obama was running for president um, against John McCain, right? Yeah, that was the first time around. Yeah, yeah, it was John McCain
Yeah,
Obama.
McCain was, yeah.
Yeah. And I was actually like I was studying something different in college. I don't have a degree in anything related to political science or like, you know, history or anything. I actually almost went to nursing school. Um, but this literally like independent media changed the trajectory of my life. I was interested in finding out what Barack Obama's foreign policy would be because I was like, this guy's middle name is Hussein. Like, there's no way someone whose middle name is Hussein would bomb the Middle East. And there's no way someone whose middle name is Hussein would like be pro-Israel. Like that's not possible,
And who
right?
studied under Edward Said?
Yes. And then I saw that and I'm like, oh my God, this guy's awesome.
Yeah.
I gotta learn more. I mean, I was very quickly disappointed, obviously, but so I was trying to find out like Obama's understanding of foreign policy, like what he might do, trying to find out his connection to Edward Said. Totally by accident, like stumble upon some video, like segment of Democracy Now! And I don't even remember what it was, but it was whatever it was. I was so like moved. I was like, oh, this is an interesting program I've literally never seen. I need to keep watching. And I just became, I was like, it's like I went down a rabbit hole. I was just like binge watching Democracy Now! It like became a thing I did. Like it literally like altered my life. Like it's where I saw Noam Chomsky for the first time. I was like, well, I got to get that guy's book. It's like I saw Naomi Klein on there. I was like, well, I got to read No Logo and Shock Doctrine. There was a guy who wrote a book called Lies My Teacher Told Me, who was like interviewed on Democracy Now! And I was like, that sounds so interesting. Bought that guy's book. I'm just like binge reading like all this stuff. And I was just like, oh my God, even though like I understood war was bad and that like the media sucks and that we're lied to, I was like, we are so much more lied to than I understand. Um, and so I like there was like no turning back. I was like, I like have no interest in what I studied. I don't want to do this. I'm like my passion is all here. So I started a blog and like I just started like writing. And then I eventually like sent it to places to be published. It got published. And then like I was like, oh, I'm kind of good at this. And then actually like my stuff was doing so well, I eventually got like offered a job. And I started working. I think my first job was at Alternate, which I don't even know if it exists anymore. I don't know if you remember what Alternate is.
Of course, yeah.
But and then like
Uh,
I like just started like freelancing for all these different lefty outlets, like in these times and The Nation and eventually I ended up at the Electronic Intifada. And it just kind of went from there. Like I kind of stumbled into journalism, and that's why I'm so passionate about independent media because I recognize the power of it. Like it's like people do understand that they're being lied to on some level, and they understand like everything around them super messed up, but sometimes they just like don't have the right language or background or knowledge base to know how to describe it, or to see the actual news. So like and now there's so much more opportunity for people to
Yeah.
stumble on like your podcast or like stumble on like the several different lefty news shows on YouTube. And I think it's so important because it literally can transform like the trajectory of people's lives.
Totally agree. And it's so interesting that you bring up Democracy Now! Ben and I, that was really, I don't want to speak for Ben totally, but we used to watch that every day, every episode, right? And I have to get your opinion on this. Until probably the first Trump administration, when they went against Julian Assange, they really wanted to start promoting
They
Russiagate.
went against Julian Assange?
Well,
I
don't
didn't
you
know that.
remember that?
yeah.
They had, and this
I
is,
stopped watching them before you did. I stopped watching them before you did because
I,
their transformation started before that. Anyways, go
they
ahead.
brought
No.
on, oh gosh, he's such a good, he was great. He was with Amy Goodman in Indonesia when she got shot at. And
Oh,
also
Alan
he
I know. Oh,
reported,
yeah.
um, they
Alan
brought him on
Nairn.
to debate. What's his name?
Alan Nairn, isn't it?
Alan Nairn. They brought in
That sounds
Alan
Yeah.
Nairn
right.
to debate Julian Assange and basically
Yeah.
Alan Nairn tried to guilt Julian Assange and say that like you got these documents from Russia to
Oh God, you're
get
kidding. I
Trump
missed
elected.
this.
It's good. You don't, I mean,
Yeah.
you can't, uh, I don't know. You think there's a floor to losing respect for people, and then it just gets lower and lower.
Oh, that's really awful.
Yeah. Well, we all know what happened to them. That sounds like you're in alignment with us on that one. Um,
Yeah.
all right. Well, speaking of media, Rania, something I've been thinking about lately is that do you feel like under Trump versus, basically any time before this, and including Trump's first administration, there's this openness to be critical like there wasn't before. I don't even know how to articulate this question, but do you feel like media in Trump is different than anything you've ever experienced before?
Yeah, definitely. And it's because most people in mainstream media are liberals. And
Mhm.
so and so like they feel like they can challenge Trump openly. Well, also Trump is just so ridiculous. Like it's like he's so ridiculous, you'd be crazy not to challenge it. But like sometimes what they do challenge and what they're critical of is so superficial that that becomes a distraction. So I'm not sure. I go back and forth on this. I'm just like, it's not up to me who's going to be president, but like the idea of like what's better for media. I mean, during the first Trump administration, I feel like everything was just about Russiagate.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
like, and that just consumed everything. So like, yeah, people were upset about like the babies in cages stuff, but that was kind of short-lived. And then it just became Russia, 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 Russia. And actually the media became more warmongering as a result of it.
Yes.
Um, they were like upset, like he was, shaking hands with the leader of North Korea, when actually that's what, if you care about ending war, you should be doing. Um, so I don't know. It's I don't think it's clear cut. I don't think it's clear cut. I mean, I do see under under Democrats, the media just does go to sleep,
Yep.
100%. But then
Mhm.
under a Republican, it's like, what are they actually challenging them on? You know what I mean? Like challenging Trump on like wanting to end the war in Ukraine. Like that should be a good thing, not a bad thing. Do I see them challenging Trump on Gaza? I don't feel like they are. I really don't. I mean, like maybe I'm wrong, but like, Trump was trying to ethnically cleanse Palestinians out of Gaza and like send them to Jordan and Egypt, and the media wouldn't even call it ethnic cleansing. Like,
Yeah.
anyway, I don't know. I don't really have like a straight answer to that question because honestly, I just feel exhausted.
Yeah.
Like,
I
I'm
mean,
exhausted.
I think that they were, again, they view him as ridiculous. That you saw the AI generated video that Trump posted.
Yeah.
And yeah, I don't know. The pushback is odd. It's not like real pushback. It's just, oh, this guy's ridiculous. Again, I don't even have a good answer to this because I couldn't even articulate the question. But yes, I agree with what you're saying.
I
But do you
feel,
know what I mean
yeah,
by
I
feeling
feel like they're just,
exhausted? Like,
yeah. I feel like the only thing they can go after him for is like his manners and
yeah.
the way he comports himself. Because, yeah, you can't really effectively criticize him on Gaza, for example, because what the fuck was just happening over the last year under Biden? So there's no meaningful criticism of him because anything that you would criticize him of, the Democrats are just as guilty of. So they have to go after him being crude and gauche and, yeah, having gold-plated weird AI videos about the Gaza resort or whatever.
Yeah, I feel like with Trump this time around though, I don't know if you guys notice it, but I feel like the media is actually like kind of tamed a little bit in the
Mhm.
sense of the first time around it was like from day one, like Trump is just horrible, where this time around they've tried to like they've like lessened it. Like I was even kind of surprised the way they haven't been calling him controlled by Putin, for example,
Yeah.
which I find
Yeah.
interesting. I'm not sure what the change is there. Like I know with Washington Post specifically, for example, it's just Jeff Bezos like trying to like curry favor with who he knows is in charge and stuff. But I don't know what the reasoning is for the rest of it. It just seems tamer. Like you don't have, the Rachel Maddow attitude like you did the first time around where every day the walls were closing in. And
Yes.
like
Yeah. And the irony about that is Trump
oh,
was
it'll come back on. Electricity. Sorry.
no, no,
This is
no, all
this is
Uh,
good.
Lebanon,
Yeah.
guys. We have
Um,
intermittent electricity. Go ahead.
no, it's just that the ironic thing about that is Trump, I guess, if you want to call it this, more pro-Russian in this second term already versus the extremely, in my opinion, anti-Russian moves that he made in that first administration.
Right. Yeah, it's also really, isn't it like jarring to see Marco Rubio of all people be the one to be saying the kinds of things like we're going to do business with Russia again. I'm just like, you were like the biggest hawk ever.
Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, obviously what's happening with this administration and the people in it is they want to fight China
Mhm.
and they feel like the best way to do that is to try to get Russia to join them in the fight against China. I don't really think that's going to work, not because Russia necessarily has principles, but like I don't think the Russians are stupid.
Right.
Like, they
Right.
could be. I don't know. They could prove me wrong, but like we'll see.
Yeah, totally.
They're not ideologically led enough in that way to want to fight China. It wouldn't be in
Well,
their
it's not in
best
their
interest at
interest.
all.
It's also
Yeah.
not in their interest. Like, it would be stupid. China's right next to them. They
Mhm.
have
Hmm.
such a close and tangled relationship with China that they benefit actually more from. Um, and the US, they don't trust the US, and rightly so.
Yeah. China's a good partner. They're reliable. Why would you not be aligned with them?
Seriously. I mean, it's just, yeah.
Ronnie, the last question I have is obviously we're all anti-Trump here, I assume. Um, what do you think an ideal resistance looks like?
Depends which part of the world you're talking about.
Sure, sure. We'll keep it US based.
Yeah. All right. We'll limit it to the US. I mean, I think an ideal resistance would be opposing, Trump's obviously like extreme domestic agenda of trying to hollow everything that matters out, like the Department of Education. Um, while also opposing Trump's attempt to bully the world. And to be consistent about it. Like, it's not just a Trump problem. Like, this is a ruling class problem. Trump just represents a segment of it. To not see Trump as different. Look, there is something unique about Trump for sure. He's more extreme. He has more of a mobster attitude. He's a bigger bully. But his agenda is ultimately the same. It's to project and maintain American dominance over the world. And I think an ideal resistance would understand and recognize that it doesn't start and end with Trump. This is a longer, ongoing fight for against this like horrific dictatorship that we have in the US that we think is democracy but isn't. So yeah, because I think the problem becomes like seeing it as a Trump problem means if Trump finishes his term and a Democrat gets elected, we're good. It's fine now. We got rid of Trump. And it's like, no, this is part of a broader problem. It represents a shift that is super important. I also think an ideal resistance would, I don't know, like avoid getting distracted by stupid things as well. And an ideal resistance would also not police itself to the point where like you have people scared to align themselves with, the Palestinian right to violently defend themselves. That's another thing too. I'm not saying that has to be at the forefront of every part of resistance to Trump in the US. I understand there's really important domestic things that need to happen to oppose Trump in terms of what he's doing, with immigrants and what he's doing, especially economically, like taking over the Treasury Department and like trying to, limit any aid anybody gets at any time, anywhere. Impoverished people in the US who are already at the margins even more. All of these things are super important. Attacking, various communities for their identities. Like these are very, very important things. But also like I just get rid of the liberalism. The liberalism is where we go to die. And stop, oh my God, most importantly, stop putting our faith in democratic leadership for anything. They are not an opposition party. Like we have to be building outside of the Democratic Party and operating outside of the Democratic Party. You want to try to pressure it, you want to try to influence it, fine. But they are not our friends. They are part of the problem and they are the reason Trump is in charge right now.
That was our interview with Rania. Wow. Loved it. Love Rania. She's so cool. Really, really inspirational. Hope you all enjoyed the interview. Let us know what you thought in the comments.
Everybody, that was Season 2, Episode 7, Film for All Seasons. I'm Dan.
I'm Andrew.
And I'm Ben.
Like, subscribe. Thanks for listening.